welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today for this conversation. So we've got Kim Faler and Jameson Johnson. Kim Faler, her show opened up a couple weeks ago here at LaMontagne Gallery, and we're really excited about it. It's called Something That Feels Like Truth. And we have Jameson Johnson here from Boston Art Review. If you guys aren't familiar with Boston Art Review, I highly recommend you check it out. It's a really wonderful publication, and they're highlighting a lot of awesome artists in Boston. So a few tips that I'm learning about. So I recommend speaker view. I think that's going to be better for everybody if you can't already see Kim, Jameson, and myself. And if anybody has any questions, then just go ahead, write in the chat and enter them. And I think Jameson and I will be kind of looking out for questions, and we'll try to answer them as they come in. Okay. Awesome. And I'll leave it to you guys now.
Cool. Well, hi everyone, welcome. It's nice to see some familiar names on the Zoom. So I thank you, Renee, for the intro and for the invitation. I'm really excited to be in conversation with Kim. Kim, I admire your work from afar, and having the opportunity to engage with it in this deeper context is really a treat. So from what I've learned over recent conversations with Kim, I think we have kindred spirits in how we interact with objects and memory and sense of self. And in the exhibition currently on view at the gallery called Something That Feels Like Truth, Kim really lingers on details, the small everyday things we don't think about that inherently make up who we are and how we walk through the world. And without reading too much into the show or hearing from Kim, just, walking in the gallery, not knowing anything about this work, the show really invites contemplation in like such a mesmerizing way. The closer you're able to get to the work and really experience it, you can see imprints of Kim across literally everything. We see her fingerprints and markings from her hands across almost every piece, and evidence from a process that really investigates materiality, like the stripping back of the canvas to reveal the stretcher bars, the marks of clay in certain pieces. And in turn, the works, in my opinion, become these little like vessels of memory and pattern and self. And when I first saw the show, and then after Kim, you and I spoke a little bit, the kind of whole idea of this show, Something That Feels Like Truth, reminded me of the stairwell in my grandparents' house. And they lived in this house for 40 years. And across like the middle of every step, there was like an indentation of where they had walked every day for 40 years. And when my grandfather passed away and my grandmother ultimately moved out of the house, I literally wanted to like take a step from their stairwell with me, because it felt like an artifact of their presence, like this place where they were every day. And I didn't. My dad was like, no, you can't do that. But Kim, what I really love about your work is that this shared sense of fascination in the mundane and the way that inanimate objects can hold versions of ourselves. So to kick off the conversation, I would love to learn more about how this show came together. I know this show is really made up largely of works that you created in the past couple of years, but really relate to much larger bodies of work that you have. And then I would love to talk a little bit more about the title and how creating this body of work that has sculpture and photography and painting has allowed you to interrogate this idea of truth. So I'll pass it to you to kind of intro some of the show.
Yeah, thanks. That was a really lovely anecdote that you shared, and you're spot on with everything else. And so this is an extension of a body of work that I've been working on for probably a half a dozen years now, really investigating the idea of an anxiety, how it is, anxiety is inherently an intimate emotion. You can't really put words to it. It's something that only you know the magnitude of it. And I'm really interested in sort of how do we not only create it, how is it quelled, how do we cope, all of these things, and how is it manifested? And so that has been my real investigation over the last 5 or 6 years or so. And that has sort of been illustrated in a couple of shows. First in a show at Russell's Gallery in 2018 called Give Me Your Anxiety, where I was really thinking about the notion of handwriting and what is the emotion that's sort of illustrated through gesture, and mostly on Post-it notes. I wanted to find something very mundane, very specific, but also something very accessible. Everyone has a relationship to sort of handwriting and Post-it notes. And so I transposed them on metal and allowed them to sort of degrade over time with acid. And so really thinking about how can the material that I choose sort of compound that idea of the emotion that I'm trying to elicit. And so that was very specifically about anxiety. And then the next exhibition, Double Bubble, which is currently on view at Mass MoCA, is a large scale installation where I was really thinking about gesture again, but more specifically, the internal gestures that we make sort of when we chew gum, and sort of the tension that is wound up in that material. And so I created a 20-inch in diameter portraits of wads of bubble gum. And there's one that's hanging in the gallery window right now, so you can see it from the outside. But they're just sort of enlarged portraits of this very intimate act, this very mundane act of chewing a wad of bubble gum. And when do we do it? And why do we do it? And what do we get out of it? And so I wanted to sort of open that up, crack that open, and sort of understand the emotion that sort of sits within that. And so in the exhibition at MoCA, there's about 20 of them that sit at head height. And you're invited to sort of walk through them and sort of confront this sort of highly emotive object head on and have a sort of conversation with it to some degree. And so with this show, something that feels like the truth, I wanted to take those same ideas, but sort of take away some of that weight, some of that gravity that inherently is inside of anxiety, and bring notions of joy and play, and allow there to be some sort of happiness that interrupts it, you know? And I stumbled across this book, Something That Feels Like Truth by Dan Listra over the pandemic. It was just, you're in the house, you start looking for books that you haven't read. And so I don't know when I bought this book, but I started reading it, and I just started to feel like, oh, this is exactly what's going on in my studio right now. There are just a bunch of really mundane stories that for no reason should be remembered, but what transpires allows them to become memories. So just sort of casual conversations at the dinner table, or stories about a hunting trip where they didn't catch anything. The very mundane stories where literally nothing happens, but the sort of emotion that unfolds and the relationships that were created or dissolved in those sort of small moments allow them to become a memory, allow them to become important. And I was like, oh, this is just like what's going on in my studio right now, where I'm using very everyday materials, things that I literally find in my studio, in my house, that I pick up that are very accessible, but then I'm sort of looking at them in a different lens and unpacking them in a different way that allow myself and hopefully others to see the value in the mundane, to see the value in sort of what's already there, and not trying to sort of reach for something that's outside of their realm, but really just sort of appreciate and unpack what's in front of them. And so Something Feels Like the Truth seemed like a very sort of poignant title for the show, because the title is Something That Feels Like Truth. It's not something that feels like the truth. And I always have to make sure that that article is not there, because I think it's really important to note that I'm interested in personal truths that, as opposed to the truth. I'm interested in how we create these truths, and how we bend over backwards to make ourselves believe that it's true, and how long can we hold that pose before like our knees give out and we have to come up with another truth. So I'm more interested in the feeling of truth rather than the truth of truth, if that makes sense. And so I felt like a lot of the work in the show really sort of exemplified that, sort of not really what it is, but how it's made, or what is the dialogue of these materials and that sit against one another, what is created there, as opposed to what is the image that these things culminate in.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And maybe we could look at, I don't know, what piece do you feel like is a good example of that? I mean, the first piece that comes to mind is Nope, which I really love because it's such like a precarious piece. It looks like it's gonna tumble over. And I think truth kind of feels a bit like that as well. Like you could poke a hole in it and it would deflate.
Right.
But at the same time, you've kind of juxtaposed it with like a really heavy material. Like you've taken this like slippery trash object of the banana and turned it into this cast like heavy object. Could you talk a little bit more about how this work came to be?
Sure. Yeah, this work is sort of an extension of a piece I did in 2016 called The Weight, where I was really thinking about an object sort of propped and stacked in a sort of very precarious way, but then really focusing on this idea of a support system or a scaffolding. What is the thing that is needed to hold this thing up? What is the thing that is needed to give it a gesture, to give it a, how can you arrange this in a way, but then not hide the system that's holding it up? I mean, I think that comes across in a lot of my work where I am sort of throwing down the backdrop and allowing you to see not only the process, but also the thing that is needed to create the thing. You know. And so this piece, I took a banana peel. At the time, my daughter was insisting on at least one banana a day, and so I was just constantly buying bananas. And you know, I feel like there's this pathos that's sort of inherent in a banana peel. It has this apathy or this empathy that's sort of imbued in it. And so I wanted to sort of take this thing that is inherently temporal, that is inherently sort of discarded, and give it value. And I feel like casting something in metal inherently gives it value. It makes it permanent. It makes it almost like a trophy. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to sort of flip this thing on its head and cast it in iron. And so I did that. And in the process of doing that, I was starting to think about, okay, so, you know, how can I give this thing some sort of gesture, but also subvert it with using essentially studio detritus to do that. So I have these very provisional props made of a pencil or a wad of clay or almost a matchstick holding up this thing that can hold up itself, you know what I mean? And it's almost crushing the support system to begin with. So I just wanted to take these ideas of sort of temporality and permanence and sort of turn it on its head a bit.
Yeah. And maybe that's a nice segue to speak a little bit about your process. You know, you say you've always been a sculptor, and you love sculpture and you love sculpture making. But this show has, thank you, Renee, for flipping to it. This show has photography and also has, you know, incorporates canvas. And can you talk a little bit about how all of these works are in communication with one another, even though there are such different mediums at play here?
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a fair question. I am a sculptor in my heart. And I feel like that comes through in all of the work. There is an inherent relationship to scale and materiality and form that I think is clear in all of the work. And I think when you're talking about the photographs, I'm really thinking about the idea of the difference between an image and an object. And when can they flip and when can they sort of be married? And so here, what I did is, this is a series called Almost Nearly. And it was a project I did that originally was intended to be read in book form. So it has this sort of almost narrative quality to it, just in the layout of it, not in the sort of content of it. But and so I was thinking about this idea of taking what is known and making it unknown, and looking at the palms of our hands. This is something that, you know, there's the anecdote that, you know, something like the back of your hand. And so it's something that is very, it's very close to us. It's a known quantity. And it also has a record of time in it. You know, it has a record of labor in it. It has a record in it. And so I just wanted to sort of open that up a bit. And so I was thinking about the palm of the hand and then taking a photograph of that. So the photograph is a photograph of a photograph. So then I'm really thinking about sort of that idea of image and object and when the photograph becomes an object. And so here you see it printed on this sort of very thin paper that's just tacked up to the wall. And so it has this very provisional feel to it, but then I took a photograph of that. So then the objecthood becomes it becomes real. And then I've cut it in half and sort of mended it together. So just putting it through another layer of sort of translation, and pinning it up to the wall as a means to sort of physically examine it and hold it up. And really look at the history that's there. And then the last image in that series is just the studio wall, and I feel like the title Almost Nearly, and then looking at this thing that's 6 inches from your face, I like the idea of sort of putting distance between you and your palm of your hand. And so I think that's what the photographs the photographs were doing. It was providing distance. Mm-hmm. And that idea of almost nearly sort of examines that distance. And then the last image being just the empty wall. I hope that idea sort of allows you to open up the dialogue beyond yourself and start thinking about the architecture or the world around you. Like, how well do you know it, and what do you not know? And what are the histories that are there that you are either acknowledging or not acknowledging? And how can we learn to listen again? And how can we learn to see again? And so that's what that series is sort of thinking about.
Yeah. And I love that this series is a part of this show because, like I said in my introduction, touch and like your mark as the maker is really evident on all of your work. I'm thinking of one of the green painting. What's the title of that one?
The one with the
yes. Yeah, and we can see like fingerprints.
Yeah.
On the side, which I really love. And it's a really stunning piece. And then I like how you're kind of playful with it and you're like, oh, well, like, I'm still here. Like my mark is still here. It almost makes you ask, like, is it unfinished? Did she mean this? Like, what's happening here? So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this. You call these paintings, but they are sculpture. You've totally torn apart the canvas, revealed components of it, and then put more elements on top of it that are not, a part of a traditional painting per se. Talk to me about these works.
Yeah, so these works are, again, an extension of that idea of what was seen in the note piece, the banana peel, where I'm thinking about structure and layers and what is the skeleton and what are the muscles, what is externally holding up the other thing. And so with all of these paintings, I'm really focusing on the structure of the painting and the layers and the surface treatment. And what happens when you start to cut through those things? What is revealed, what is concealed, and what can be exaggerated? And so with a lot of these paintings, like for example, So Close, the handprints I feel like are really important because it breaks down the barrier between you and the painting. It makes you part of the same space as the painting. Mm-hmm. And it brings a sense of vitality to it. You know what I mean? Like you knew where my hands were or someone's hands were. It is a record of that. There was an activity there. I'm very much interested in showing the process and not sort of hiding it behind this veil of finished work, mm-hmm. sort of traditional sense. And so this piece here, So Close, it was the first of the series of these 4 large scale paintings. And it began thinking again about that idea of gesture. And I just simply started by drawing a circle. Then that drawing was sort of cut and it became a negative space. And then it was turned into wire and it became a sort of physical line. And so really, again, playing with that idea of image and object and how these two things can sort of talk to one another. And sort of what's left when you take the meat out of an object, you know what I mean? Like what's left, how can you focus on the sort of peripheral as much as you do the center of the canvas? Yeah. And that's sort of what the little weight in the center, the little graphite weight sort of meant to denote.
Yeah. And speaking of activity, that reminds me of Cole, and where you have your hand quite literal. Is it your hand that is the cast in the center?
Oh, the small cast paintings.
Yep.
Renee, can you? Yeah. Yeah. So those are all my fingertips. Yeah. So these these are fun little paintings. They're a series of 3 paintings that are cast in brass and iron, and they're a little bit hard to describe in the sense of how they're made, but they are sort of my fingertips running through a wad of clay. And so that's sort of like what's left over. And these pieces specifically talk more so about that idea of surface and that tension between the surface and what's beneath and which is more real or which is more the painting. And the fun thing about these is I feel like they're really become real when people see the backside, because they are cast. And so when you see the backside, which unfortunately we don't have any photos of it, but you see the wax marks, the tool marks, the things that make it real. And so there's this unpacking of the work that happens. And the title cull, C-U-L-L, is a term that is used at the time I was working in a foundry, and the Kohler foundry, and they have all these sort of, in my mind, pristine Kohler objects all over the factory. And a lot of them had these marks that denoted sort of flaws, and those were called culls, and they were all rejected. And so for all intents and purposes, there was no personality in the factory environment, but I really enjoyed watching sort of the factory workers like point out the errors and make their mark, so to speak, on these objects. And so that is where the series sort of jumped off of.
Gotcha. What was being made at this factory?
Oh, it's the Kohler factory, where toilets, faucets, bathroom.
Yep.
Tubs. So,
yeah, I mean, I just love these. And I love that you gave such a heavy object action. Like you can tell there's like such a weight to these. I would love to see the backside and to hold one in my hand, but then you add these kind of like playful pastel, like vibrant colors, and then, totally etch your markings into them. It's like such a fun juxtaposition. And these are very recent, right? You made these in like,
they're like, the first one I made in 2019, and the last one I finished, a couple months ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're in your studio now. Do you want to talk a little bit about where you are? And you don't have to show us beyond what's behind you, but just to orient us.
Most of what was in my studio is in the gallery now. So I am currently working on a small edition of, I made sort of smaller versions of the wads of bubblegum, and I'm doing a fundraiser for Mass Mocha. And so I'm currently casting about 100 of these and finishing them. So it's a bit of a factory line over here, but.
And I actually, while you were just talking, I had another question come to my mind about Cole. Could you go back to the blue one, Renee? So yeah, that one's great. This piece of the markings of it really remind me of Howardina Pindel's work, where she's annotating like the actions of things. It was like the first thing that I thought of when I saw that movement. And I was curious, who are some artists, people? I mean, you mentioned the book that you were inspired by, like who's kind of on your radar for someone you're constantly looking to?
Yeah. Well, I think it's funny when people ask that question, your mind immediately goes blank, and you're just like,
I know.
No
so
artist.
Like, who your favorite? They were like, who's your favorite artist the other day? And I was like, why would you ask me that? Don't ask me that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But for these paintings, I'm sort of embarrassed that I just sort of dove into the Arte Povera, but I have. And for the last year or so, I've been looking a lot at Arte Povera, and I feel like it is a really rich sort of art movement that only lasted, I don't know, some people say 5 years. But I feel like their relationship to materiality and experience and time and the body, and just sort of playing with the idea of the realness of objects and the realness of materials, and allowing the viewer to really be present when experiencing art, I feel like that has become really valuable to me. And so I recently went to Magazino up the Hudson Valley and saw the collection there. And I'm hoping to go down to the Smithsonian and do some research down there as well. But I just feel like there's a lot of information that they sort of processed in a short amount of time that has then sort of lived on through other contemporary artists. And I just want to sort of do a little bit more research on some of the artwork that was made during that period. But that's sort of who I've been looking at most recently. But then, other artists that sort of have influenced me. There's a really great Canadian artist, Valerie Blass, and obviously Jim Hodges, and sort of my core artist, Ava Hess and Louise Bourgeois and Duchamp, things like that. But there's a ton of artists, Never ask an artist what artists they like, because they'll just.
I know. I'm sorry. Cruel question. And with this body of work, you know, such an obvious point of inspiration. It was like, you were just taking what was around you. You were taking objects and things from your home. And you mentioned, I can't recall if it was in your monograph or in a conversation that we had, but, you know, just taking these things that like come up around us, like a pile of magazines that were once read and loved, but now the object is the pile of magazines. And I love how you've transformed them.
Yeah.
I have a question about the title. I know we talked about it a little bit at the beginning. You know, the truth, this idea of truth, and you kind of specified like, the show is not interrogating the truth, but truth at, you know, the notion of truth. But this idea of truth is really kind of politicized right now. I mean, we had a president who denied truth for 4 years, and there's talk every day about fake news and fake media and truth versus non-truth. How do you feel this work relates to this idea of truth in kind of like a grander sociopolitical model rather than just kind of your own personal truth?
I think it's more, like I said, about the feeling of truth rather than the truth.
The truth, yeah.
Find a truth. I think it's more about the feeling that we all get to sort of find peace. I think that's what I'm interested in, and I think COVID. I mean, this work was mostly made over COVID, and I think COVID has really illustrated sort of what. How quickly reality can change, and that idea of what is true and what is certain. And I think with a lot of my work, I try to really embrace that idea of uncertainty and sort of how can we cradle that as something that is valuable. And I feel like the period over COVID, when, you know, for all intents and purposes, you couldn't plan 1 month, 2 months, 6 months out because you just didn't know what it looked like. You know what I mean? So the ground that we were standing on was like probably the most unstable that we've ever had. And we really had to relearn how to walk and relearn how to sort of understand what is normal. And I think a lot of the work sort of tries to sort of hold that fragility and sort of see that as something valuable and try to find the importance in that. And so, like I said, I'm really interested in sort of that notion of how do we cope, and how do we find the truth in our lives, whatever that is, whether it be political, personal, emotional, what have you. I mean, I think all these things are completely constructed and completely malleable, and that's something that we often forget.
Yeah, and I love the connection that you made to kind of like early COVID days. I remember my partner and I were thinking about like driving somewhere. We're like, maybe we should like leave Boston for a little bit and drive somewhere. And I was like, no, I don't want to like leave my house and my things. Like it was totally irrational. I was like, my books, my like things that like don't matter. I was like, I don't want to like leave these things. And I talked about it with other friends, and they were like, yeah, all of a sudden, like during COVID, I felt this like crazy connection to like things that I never really thought about before. So I'm glad to hear you say that as well. And that you were also like kind of clinging to these objects or finding or investigating them. So I know you said a lot of these works were really created during COVID times. What's the most like recently completed, or is there a piece that you feel is like especially emblematic of that time during COVID where you were creating?
I mean, they all are. I mean, it's sort of a spectrum that we all went through for COVID, you know, like, you know, the first, you know, I don't even know what to say. The first quarter of it, I think we all thought that it was going to be over in a minute. And that was like a year ago. So they all have a spectrum. I mean, the first one I made was Yo-Yo, which I think is this one here. So here I was, I took the stretcher bars and actually dyed them purple, and then applied this sort of shroud on top of it, and then applied again the sort of slab of plaster that is on one side highly polished and on the other side completely raw and even sort of spilled upon. And then there's like this very tiny, I don't know if Renee has the detail, but there's a very tiny seashell that sort of sits in between the two, and a very thin fishing line that sort of dances between these two finishes of the plaster, the highly polished one and the highly rough one. And the idea of, you know, constantly, I mean, I feel like at the beginning of the pandemic, you turned on the radio and you just didn't know what you would hear. And it was just constant, like, things are great, things are terrible, things are great, things are terrible. And just that constant finding equilibrium. And I felt like that was the first piece I made in COVID. And the second one was the Still Yes, which is the yellow one. And that one was an extension of an installation I did where I was creating all these sort of wall fragments that were leaning against this yellow wall. And so here I tried to like see if I could turn that into a painting. And of course I couldn't. So I had to sort of reinvent it, which was totally fine. I mean, that's sort of what happens. And so I was making the structure and I was just like, I got to cut it in half. There's got to be this fissure, this like before and after sort of moment that happens. And then sort of compounding that by adding this burnt piece of wood, this sort of, if you could go back, Renee, to the other, sort of allowing this fissure to sort of be sort of caramelized or make it a little bit more real or something. So I had this burnt piece of wood that's then flanked by this sort of very loud plexiglass. There's blue plexi on both sides. And so I wanted this sort of vibration that happens, the sort of allow it to sort of move a little bit. And then obviously the shift in the canvas, this sort of, like I said, in the canvas to sort of allow it to be exaggerated, this sort of before and after. And so this piece is called Still Yes, which is, I felt like, all of the plans during the pandemic were like, yes, they're still on, but they're not. And so there was this constant like stop gap of what is time and what are your plans and how are they shifting and really what's important, what do you need to hang on to and what can just sort of fall to the wayside.
And I love that you have the tacked on note here, which says yes and connects, I think, probably to Give Me Your Anxieties and other bodies of work where you incorporate text and handwriting.
Yeah, like I wanted to sort of activate the painting. Like I always want my work to be very accessible. Like I want someone who knows nothing about art or nothing about me to be able to sort of hold on to something. And I felt like putting that note on there really, it did something. It sort of made it electric or something, and it allowed it to sort of be pulled back into our space and not in the space of like the painting.
It totally does. And I'm so glad you said that because, Renee, if you can flip back to the larger view of this work, like this is a beautiful object. Like it's like though it has rough edges and there's like, the burnt is like kind of bespoke, but there's something that's very like finished about this object. And it looks like very clean and solid. And then there's like this like fun gesture on it, which is your handwriting. And it totally kind of like pushes down the entire thing and shows that there's like a sense of humor and a human behind it, which I really, really love.
And that's what I hope happens with all my work. I mean, that's why the handprints are on so close. And that's why, I left the tape because I want to break that idea of like the magician artist, you know what I mean? And it's just materials and it's just emotion and it's just gesture that's all being captured. And I want the viewer to feel a part of that. I don't want them to feel like they're in a different world or they're really disconnected. And I also want it to feel grounded in the space that we're living in. You know what I mean? These things are in the same room. They're not, yes, they're on a gallery wall in a white cube, and that can't be more sort of medicinal, but they are the same environment that you're physically standing in. So I want that relationship, that experience is important to me. And so when I do things that are often deemed as misbehaving, like coloring painting the wall behind it, it's important. It's not frivolous.
No, absolutely. And, thinking within the canon of like, oh my gosh, could you imagine some like old man minimalist artist like approaching a work like this with humor? Like, no way. It would be like way too self-serious. So I love that you're taking like some of the same ideas and then like totally deconstructing it.
Yeah. And then the last painting that I made, which I finished, I think about a month ago, was Lake Sugar, which is the pink one there. And this one was just, it's funny, like some of these paintings, I feel like they sort of develop as I work on them. And this one was different. This one I literally like saw and drew and then made, and it looked exactly like I drew it, which never happens. but this one was fun. I was really thinking about that idea of skin and surface. And so the top portion of this painting is a very soft, and you wouldn't know it unless you touched it. It's a very soft foam, like it's like what your pillow is made of. It's very soft. And I want
is
what the pink part, yeah. Yeah, it looks like insulation foam. It looks like that like hard foam, but it's very soft. And maybe at the end, Renee can go over and push on it. But I really like that idea of something that sort of can cradle or capture touch and or capture pressure in that way. And so I sort of threw a dart at it to sort of illustrate its sort of ability to permeate one space to the next. And then I have these sort of, I have a sort of a string of marbles at the bottom that the sort of, I don't want to say they move back and forth, but they have this gesture of movement. And this, in the article that Leah wrote, I think she compared them to rosaries, which I thought was really beautiful, or an abacus. And so I just have this sort of juxtaposition of sort of the top and the bottom, and then this sort of purple ooze that sort of drips over the surface. Once again, like sort of breaking that barrier between the viewer and the object.
Yeah. And I love the way that it's split, because it actually kind of implies that perhaps there is a continuation of the thread of marbles behind it. Like there's like a planetary movement, and it's continuing behind the foam. And I'm glad to hear you talk about that texture. And it actually relates to what I said about like my grandparents' stairwell and like holding the depression of human touch. I
mean, I think that idea of touch and gesture, I mean, I think COVID has made that so apparently important to us. You know what I mean? So much is gathered just through your fingertips, or not gathered through screen culture. You know what I mean? That notion of knowledge that's gained through personal interaction, I think is really something that needs to be cherished.
Yeah. Well, I think we've totally explored, I mean, so much of this work. We can continue to talk about it, but I would love to open it up to our audience here and see if they want to ask you any questions or revisit anything. And you all are welcome to unmute yourselves and say hi, or if you want to drop something into the chat and have us read your question, we can do that as well. Crystal left a really beautiful comment in the chat. I'm sure everyone saw it, but she said, I really love these paintings compared to your other more sculptural pieces. The materials here feel ad hoc and completely elemental or essential, as if you had to find new ways of communicating using what was on hand during the COVID era. That's, yeah, a great comment.
I mean, you know, we've got 15 people here, so I can even stop screen sharing, or we can keep it up. We'll just be able to interact a little bit better.
Yeah, you can take off our spotlights if you want.
Yeah.
Gallery mode.
Yeah.
Renee, do you want to go over and touch my painting?
Yeah, I should do that. Okay. Remove my spotlight. Just momentarily.
So many black squares. If you guys feel comfortable putting your cameras on, I love seeing faces, but truly no pressure. Oh, hi, Maya. Nice to see you.
I actually have a question if you guys want to take it. I love your use of color, specifically like the pinks and the purples and the green, like very striking. So I was just curious about how you think about color and how it kind of informs your greater project.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I feel like color is really important. And I probably would say that's my most painterly attribute, is my use of color. If anyone wants to call me a painter, it's because of that. I feel like, as with objects, there's a lot of information that comes with color. There's a vibrancy to it. I mean, using, with the like sugar one that Renee just touched, I was really hoping to get a very pale pink, because I knew I wanted a really saturated purple. And I knew if I didn't want them to sort of compete with one another, I really wanted the purple to feel like it was sort of owning the pink. And so I feel like there's a lot of sort of subtle passive things that you can do with color that you can't really always do with image making or objecthood. So I feel like color is a really important toolbox that I take very seriously.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi, Kim. I have a question, and you've kind of addressed it throughout your talk, but I know you work in a lot of different scales, and can you speak to how, when you're setting out to make work, how you decide or how you intuit or
Right.
how you think about scale in your work?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Scale is also really important. I feel like it has an inherent relationship to the body. And like with the piece at Mass Mocha, I knew that I wanted to take this very small object and sort of increase the size tremendously. So it felt confrontational, or it felt, it just had a different resonance than you would when it was tiny. But most often than not, I'm working at a 1-to-1 scale, and things are actual size. But with the paintings, I knew that I wanted them to be sort of, I wanted them to sort of allow you to walk up to them and sort of consume you. And so I wanted them to be a pretty good size, as opposed to like the small call paintings. I wanted it to be sort of a small, intimate gesture. And so I knew that it didn't have to be huge. And so I think with all of my work, I'm looking to sort of reduce it to its essentials and allow what's there to sort of own the experience.
Thank you.
Hi, Kim. Hi. Congratulations. This is beautiful. You'll appreciate that I have been in transit because my daughter packed her laptop into a bag that she dumped water into.
Oh no.
So I thought you would appreciate why I'm somewhat delayed in showing myself, because I started this conversation at the Apple store. I just, one comment, I think I'm going to take with me very much this idea of the image versus the object, because another story of my day, they're not always in the mom role, but that she's graduating 8th grade and they've asked us for her kindergarten picture, and I don't have it.
Oh no.
And I don't know why. I'm sure one of the grandparents does, but the notion that this image is now an object that is going to represent that I didn't do my job because it's not present.
That is the worst.
No, but it's such a perfect way that you're contemplating this idea of when an image is an object, and I was struggling with that very idea 2 hours ago. So thank you for putting a word to that, and actual words to that. But my one request was if you could walk around the gallery one more time for those of us who aren't going to get a chance to see it in person.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna try and, I don't know, maybe I should pin myself one more time here. There we go.
Yeah.
It's so awkward to try and do with the laptop.
Oh, of course. But I particularly wanted to see the banana sculpture, seeing that in a image form. Oh, wow. Thank you.
Okay, so
the little double bubble sculptures in the window, but it's really hard to get to. So don't bother with that.
Yeah. You're not to see it.
Yeah. So.
All right, I'm gonna unspotlight if I can. I don't know where. I have to find myself. Sorry, guys, bear with me.
Thanks for the other view. It is fun to see Nope, the banana piece, in person, in not photograph form. I love the shadows of it, and it looks almost like a little creature that is like frozen right in that position. It's really, really lively.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely, works like this are just so, it's valuable when you get to see them in person. Obviously, Kim has a really wonderful photographer. I'm not even sure who it is, but as you guys saw, they did really great pictures of the work, but still, we recommend coming in if anybody feels comfortable doing so. The exhibition's open through May 1st. We'll be open that whole Saturday until 5 p.m. So if you can make it in, we would love to have you and talk about the work some more.
Yeah. And Kim, maybe I'll ask a final question unless anyone else wants to jump ahead of me.
Sure.
Okay. I always like to close the conversation with what's on the horizon.
What's on the horizon? Yeah. In these times of uncertainty. I think I'll probably, like, at that last painting, like Sugar, I like that idea of the cast foam. And I was thinking about the next piece sort of being an extension of that, in the sense of doing something that really captures weight and captures that sense of touch and compression. I feel like there's a little bit more I can explore in that regard. So probably more paintings and more sort of pushing these ideas, and hopefully more joy.
Yeah. Is there a medium and material that you're like eyeing working with next?
I never really know until I start to get into it. It usually is just sort of a springboard to, oh, this really needs neon, or, oh, this really needs dirt. You know, it's not sort of a logical thing, but more of an intuitive thing. And so we'll see what unfolds. Right now, I'm excited about the sort of soft foam and seeing where that goes.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, thank you for your really thoughtful questions, and I appreciate you guys spending time looking at the work in a meaningful way.
Yeah, thank you. It's so nice to see all of you, and I will echo Renee. I mean, this work is so lovely to see in person if you can, but also the website does have really stunning photos. And I also want to just really quickly give like the biggest kudos to Kim for this beautiful monograph. I make print magazines, and I'm obsessed with paper and print and touch. And I mean, like, the binding is stunning. It has this beautiful like cardboard cover. It lays flat. I mean, it's just such a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book that I will treasure. I'm really happy to have it. And I think you have some copies in the gallery. Is that right, Renee?
Yeah, we do. We're going to have more shortly too. So.
Okay.
And I think you can have a couple of my little stress balls that I made.
Yeah. Oh, I should have brought those. We have these awesome stress balls. You showed something earlier. Why don't you just because your video is kind of smaller since I was screen sharing. Yeah. I
made like a stress ball version of my little bubble gums.
That's so fun.
Yeah. So we have those in the gallery if anybody would like to buy one. So they're lovely.
Well, thanks everyone. I appreciate you guys taking the time.
Bye everyone. Nice to see you.
Nice to have you. All right.